Hello, and welcome to another episode of OpenNMS 101. My name is Taras Balog. I'm one of the maintainers of the OpenNMS project, and in this lesson, we're going to be discussing notifications. Now, the OpenNMS 101 course material is designed to be done in order. So if you haven't done the exercises in Module 2 or Module 3, you may want to go do those now. Now, you can get some stuff out of these lessons without having done that, but as far as the exercises go, I'm not going to go back and do everything, and each module will build on what has gone before. With that said, I want to point out that this module is one of the longest that we have, and even when I've split it up into two parts. In this one, we're going to talk about notifications in general and do an exercise. And in the next module, which should be considerably shorter, we're just going to talk about specific notification commands. We're going to create a custom notification command. Now, what are notifications? Well, in the last module, we talked about how we have events. So OpenNMS can gather events from different sources. We can also generate events. Notices are designed to say, okay, this particular event is important and I need to tell somebody about it. And the way this works is an event happens, it is looked up in a configuration file in the notification daemon, and it says if that event happens to match a notice will be triggered. And if that notice is triggered, it will walk a path. We call this a destination path, which determines who gets notified and how they get notified. You can build escalations into the path. So you might say, send an email immediately, wait 5 minutes. If no one acknowledges the notice, send a page. If after 30 minutes no one's acknowledged it, email the manager, etc. I know some customers who have 7 or 8 levels of escalation built in. Now note, it's not a replacement for a trouble ticketing system. OpenNMS as a platform is very flexible. And usually when people come to me, I can find a way to implement what they want, but it may not be easy to maintain. One example that comes to mind is someone wanted emails to be sent during the day and pages to be sent at night. And you can do that, but it's a little bit trickier, whereas that functionality might be built into the trouble ticketing system you're using. OpenNMS does have a trouble ticketing API that will allow you to send information to a trouble ticketing system, and I recommend that. We'll talk about that in another lesson. Now, a number of notices are built into OpenNMS. If you remember from the third module, we talked about the UEI, the event UEI, that uniquely identifies an event, unique event identifier. We usually refer to a particular UEI by the last section. It's usually a very long string. It may say like uei.openms.org/internal/discovery/new suspect. We just call that a new suspect event. So built in, we have node down, interface down, node lost service, node added, interface deleted, and some threshold events. Now, in the data model in OpenNMS, devices are supposed to be referred to as nodes. A node is supposed to represent a physical device. It can represent a virtual device as well, but in the original thinking, a node was a device. On that device, because it's a network device, there would have to be at least one interface. And on that interface, there would be a service, at least one service. And so those are the big three. A node down means the device is completely down. Interface down means one part of the device and interface is down. And a node lost service event means just a service running on an interface is down. Node added is there because you may want to know when things are discovered on your network. And then interface deleted is just another event we put in notices for an example. Now notices are off by default. And I would turn them off during restarts. There can be a little bit of chaos when you start OpenNMS and it's trying to do, especially on large networks, it's trying to do lots of pings and threshold checking. So I always recommend that you turn off notifications during a restart and wait 2 or 3 minutes until it reaches a steady state, turn it back on again. This will help decrease the number of extraneous events. Now, if you look on the web UI, I'm going to go back to the web UI, you should be looking at something like this by this point in time. If you look in the upper right-hand corner, you'll see this little bell with Ghostbusters no symbol on it. This bell right here just tells me that notifications are off. And the way I turn them on is I go to the admin. Look at me. See, I shouldn't have been logged in as admin user. So I'll log out. I'll log back in as me. You never want to be logged in as the admin user, and notifications is one of the reasons. To be perfectly honest, I taped the show yesterday, did it perfectly, one take, no errors, and then I realized I'd left my mic off. So I tested the mic today, and you should be hearing me talk because it's a lot more useful with my voice. Anyway, so now I'm logged in as Taurus. I'm going to go up under Configure OpenNMS, and you'll see right in the middle of the screen here, there's notification status, on, off. So I'm going to go to on, click update, and now you'll notice that the bell is now green. This lets me know at a glance that globally notices are turned on. Now, when we start looking at individual notices, we can turn them on or off individually. But this is globally, and the way I like to describe it is, when I was putting myself through school, I worked in an injection molding plastics plant, made things like weed eater housings and drink mixers. And so what you would do is you'd open a machine, pull out a part, shut the machine, trim the part, put it in a box, and if everything was going well, by the time you finished that, it was time to open the door again and repeat. It's a great motivator to get you to finish school, which I did. Now, on the side of this machine, there's a big Van Dorn injection molding machine. There was a red button. And the idea was if something drastically went wrong, you'd mash the red button and it would stop the machine. This is OpenNMS's big red button when it comes to notifications. Now, let's just assume someone who shall remain nameless, me, was editing some OpenNMS code and misplaced some parentheses. So instead of notification filters being very exact and only causing notices to be sent on a few events, it pretty much passed everything. So every single event on a very, very large OpenNMS installation sent notices. Let's say, just for a figure, around 80,000 SMSs. If you notice that that's a problem, this is when you go and mash your big red button. So you can stop notifications, roll back to a release that doesn't have this problem, and fix it so that it doesn't happen in the future. Anyway, that's water under the bridge, but that's an example of this, the use of the notification status button. So now we've got our notices turned on. We'll go back to the slides. Now, I've been talking for almost 3 hours now, if you've been following these lessons, and we haven't actually monitored anything. We haven't actually put in a node. So we're going to do that now. Now, a lot of systems forget this. We have a very powerful provisioning system built into OpenNMS, because if we want to monitor the Internet of Things, if we want to monitor millions of devices and billions of metrics, you've got to have some way of managing all that. Now, we do have automated discovery. You can point your OpenNMS at a subnet, hit go, and it will go and discover the devices on that subnet. And I do still use that. But for the most part, I try to use directed discovery, which is what I tell OpenNMS what I want to monitor. And this is what most of our large customers do. They will have some sort of internal system. Some internal system that will tell them, hey, here's what I have, here's my moves, adds, and changes. They send that into OpenNMS via a variety of methods. We're going to use a manual one, but there's ways to automate that. And they send that into OpenNMS, and that's how they provision OpenNMS. So we are going to start by creating what is known as a requisition. So let me go back to the admin page here, and you'll see under provisioning, there's manage provisioning requisitions. So I'm going to click on that. And this will load my requisitions. Requisitions, at its heart, is literally just an XML file. And what we are going to do is create this XML file through the GUI. We can edit it, we can modify it. Once it is where we think it should be, we then synchronize that file with the system, and it will go and do all the adds and discovery for us. So I'm going to click Add Requisition, and I'm going to call this requisition class because I have zero imagination. So now we have our class requisition. And notice that this is in red. Now there's things to notice. The last update, so I last updated it today, which is January 20th. At 11:43 Eastern Time. The last import is never. So we've never imported this requisition. We never synchronized it. There are no nodes in the requisition and no nodes in the database. So our first step is to add a node. So I'm going to click on the Edit Requisition. There are no nodes on the class requisition, so I'm going to add one. So I'll click the Add Node button. Now, there are two layouts. There is horizontal layout, which is on by default. And in the horizontal layout, all these different sections are little tabs. I prefer the vertical layout, which kind of puts everything on one screen. If we have a big fault with OpenNMS, it's that we're really loath to remove any feature. So originally this was written with the horizontal layout, and then I believe it was Alejandro said, I don't really like this, it's not efficient for me, so he wrote the vertical layout. Technically we should probably just get rid of the horizontal layout, but there may be people who like it. So what we've done is we leave it in. What this does is mean it creates a lot of options with OpenNMS, and it can be daunting to new users. So I apologize for that, but please understand we're doing it in the name of freedom. So we want to give you the freedom to use what you want. But in the future, we may take a more aggressive stance to kind of prune things out. So I've got my node. So I'm adding my first node to OpenNMS. The one thing I want you to notice is this foreign ID, this kind of odd-looking number here. Now, this foreign ID is a key concept of provisioning. Unfortunately, there's nothing in the management realm that can uniquely identify a device. For example, let's suppose I'm Rackspace Managed Hosting. Rackspace Managed Hosting was one of our early customers. They're a large hosting provider in Texas. And let's suppose that they have a server, and it's number 1234. Now, I know by now they've moved all cloudy and everything's virtual, but let's assume it's a physical server, 1234. And let's assume it's running Windows and IIS, so it's a web server. And it's sitting there, it has a particular IP address and a particular host name. And let's also suppose, continuing with the analogy, that a customer calls up and says, hey, I'm having a lot of issues with my server, I'm having connection issues. And one of the technicians, who are very bright, goes through and they discover that it looks like the NIC card's bad. There's lots of errors and stuff, so they need to replace the NIC card. But what they also notice is that this customer hasn't really paid their bills. So they go to the customer and say, well, we're not going to fix it till you pay your bills. Maybe there's a big kerfuffle. And basically what ends up happening is the customer says, keep it, I'm done. So they decommission the box 1234. But before they put it back on the shelf, they replace the NIC card because they know the NIC card's bad. So here we have asset 1234 sitting on the shelf, and it's ready to go. So very soon, because they have lots of new customers, lots of growth, customer calls up, says, hey, I need a Linux box running MySQL. So they take server 1234 off the shelf, put Linux on it, install MySQL, and they give it a new host name and a new IP address. So think of what has changed. We have this node that had a certain IP address, a certain host name. It was running Windows, running IIS, and had a certain MAC address. And now we have the same node, but it's got a different operating system and a different IP address and a different host name and different services and a different MAC address. There's no way for a management system, including OpenNMS, to know that that's the same box automatically. But companies like Rackspace track that stuff, so they know. So the idea of a foreign ID is you could put something like, I could go in here and I could put 1234 as the foreign ID, and the combination of the requisition class name and the foreign ID 1234 uniquely identifies that node. So I can change things about the node. I can say, oh, here it's got a new host name. Oh, it's got a new IP address, and I could keep the historical knowledge about this device, should I so choose. That's kind of cool. I'm going to just hit auto-generate. If you auto-generate, what it's going to do is it's going to show the current time in Unix epoch time. So that is a number that is based upon how many seconds or hundredths of a second have passed since midnight the morning of January 1st, 1970. And it's, considering that it's pretty granular, we use it because the chance of having two identical foreign IDs generated this way is very, very slim. So for the node label, this is something we create, and you need to take some care. I am not. I am going to call this localhost. When I teach this class, I'm quite frequently teaching it at a customer site, and we're using virtual machines on laptops. And what I don't want to have to do is I don't know what kind of network resources will be available to me. So I do know that I can create a node called localhost because there is the laptop itself is the localhost node. So I'm going to put localhost. What you want to think about in creating a node label is how you canonically define the devices on your network. Because, as I'll show in the future, if you are consistent, you can use the node label to access other systems that are also keyed off of node label. So suppose I have an asset management system, I might be able to craft a URL, plug in this notification label so that an operator in OpenNMS can click on a link that actually goes directly to that system. So think about it. But in this case, we're going to call ours localhost. And next, every device is pretty much needs an IP address. And I'm going to use 127.0.0.1. That is the localhost address. And it's usually described as loopback 0, so LO0. I'm going to put that in the description. I can put anything I want here, but and it's displayed in a few places, but it's not heavily used by OpenNMS. But this is where you would have like ETH0, SE0, whatever the name of your interface is, pretty much the interface description in SNMP, which we'll talk about later. But in this case, I'm just going to do LO0. And also, speaking of SNMP, you can ignore this SNMP primary thing for the time being. The SNMP primary interface is the interface that will be used for all SNMP requests. And when we talk about SNMP, it plays much more of a role. So now I have my node label, localhost, my IP address, 127.0.0.1, and now I'm going to add a service. Now here are all the services we know about by default. We've got DNS, FTP, different versions of HTTP, HTTPS, the Hyperic agent if you're running it, ICMP, that's a big one, IMAP, LDAP, JMX services, VMware, WSMan, all of this stuff. Now, we prefer that you automatically discover these. We have detectors built in, which I'll talk about in a minute. And these detectors go out and they find services on your devices. So we don't have to put a service here. But I wanted to demonstrate that I can force a service to be on a node. I could force, if I hit this click down, I could force, say, MySQL to be on the server. And we won't do any tests. Basically, we'll create, OpenNMS will create a node, create an interface, and assign the service to it. This can be a little bit dangerous because if that service doesn't exist, it'll be marked as down. And so what I like to do is either not discover any services or discover just ICMP. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to hit save. And now I have my foreign ID, node label, and I have this interface. There are tons of other things you can add. We'll talk about path outage later in this lesson. You can add various categories to further categorize this particular node. You can add tons of asset information. You can do all of this through a number of ways. We have a REST interface that allows you to do this. You can script it, but for purposes of this class, we're going to use the GUI. Now I'm going to hit save, which will get rid of that red save. I'll hit return, and now I'm looking at my class requisition, which has one node defined. I'm going to hit return a second time to bring me back to my requisition page. So now as you can see, it's still red because it's never been synchronized. So I haven't imported it ever. There's one node defined in the requisition and there's no nodes in the database. So at this point in time, I'm going to go over here and I'm going to click these two arrows that say synchronize. Now this brings up a dialog. Now our customers are very, very creative with this, and you don't have to have like one requisition for everything. Some customers divide it up by their customers. So if they're monitoring a bunch of different customers, each separate customer will have its own requisition. They might do it by device type, so they might have a server requisition, they might have a router requisition, they might have a switch requisition. They might do it by a geographical location. So if they have an office in New York, and an office in Philadelphia, and an office in DC, and an office in Seattle, they can go through and create one of those. We do have customers who have tens of thousands of requisition nodes in one requisition, and so they've asked us for a variety of different options when doing a synchronization. Now I'm going to hit yes to synchronize because this is a brand new requisition, and this does everything. It'll go through and analyze every single node in the requisition, which in my case is just one. If I choose no, what it'll do is it'll only scan and synchronize on any changes. So if I've added some nodes and I remove some nodes, it'll only synchronize on those changes. For large requisitions, this can greatly speed things up. Even though our scan phase is only a few seconds and it's multi-threaded and it's very efficient, a few seconds times 10,000 devices is a significant amount of time. Now, if you don't really use the scan phase, if you're only looking at assigning services to a particular interface and node, you might hit DB only. And what this will do is this will go through, force everything, and it'll just skip the scan phase. Or you can, of course, cancel out of this dialog box. I'm going to hit yes, because that's what I want to do. And you'll get this import operation has been started, and it's all white now. And right now, we actually have the provisioning going on. So I'm going to refresh this. And now you'll see I've got one node defined in my requisition, and I have one node in the database. So all is right with the world. It is possible to have these numbers be different. Usually if they're different, it means something has changed and the requisition has not been synchronized. And usually in the GUI, this will be indicated with that red background. It'll kind of tell you that, hey, I need attention. You know, someone's done something, but they haven't finished. So I need them to finish. So let's go back to the slides and go over what we did. Repetition is basic to all learning, so let's repeat. So we went to the configure OpenNMS manage provisioning requisitions. There weren't any, so we added one. We called it class. In the class requisition, there are a variety of different things that we can do. There's the name of the requisition, the last time it was modified, the last time it was imported, and there are a number of little buttons that we can press. You can delete the requisition, you can delete the nodes in the requisition, etc. Now, we edited the requisition and we added a node. And there's the horizontal layout, which I don't care for. You may like. It's up to you. The vertical layout kind of puts everything on one page. And so what we did is we added a localhost node with a particular foreign ID. We then added an interface, and we forced the ICMP service to be associated with that interface. Then we click save and a couple of returns. Then we synchronized it. When we synchronized it, we ended up getting adding a node. Now, remember, this is actually a lesson on notices. Might have forgotten that over the last few minutes as I've not talked about notices. But remember that we actually have node added as a default notice. So we should have a notice now. So if I go to my main page, look, yay, it worked. I have a notice. So I can click on my outstanding notice. Notice it's notice ID 1. It's based upon event ID 21, and it says, OpenNMS has discovered a new node named localhost. Please be advised. And if I click on that, I'll get a little bit more information, and it'll tell who was notified. Now, the reason in Module 2 we added our new user, in my case Taurus, to the admin group is that by default, notices are sent via email to anyone in the admin group. So you can see that both the Taurus user and the admin user were notified at the same time via Java email. And we'll come back to this in a second. One thing I want to talk about are events. So let's go back here. And what we are going to do is notice that in the notification window, we've got the notification time, time replied and responder. No one has acknowledged this. So I'm going to go ahead and acknowledge this. So notice the responder was me, and I acknowledged it at this time. This is the key point. This is why you don't want everyone using the admin user, because if they do, you don't know who of the possible users responded to this notice. Now you know it was me. This event had a node associated with it, localhost. It did not have an interface or a service associated with it. If it did, those would be displayed here. Now I can click on this link and go to our localhost node. And this brings up the node page. We will be spending a lot of time on this node page. Notice the name is localhost. We have this, this little database sign 1. The very first device that gets discovered by OpenNMS is assigned a node ID, node ID 1. The second one will be node ID 2. The third ID one will be node ID 3. This isn't canonical in any way. It's basically just whatever gets discovered first. So if I took two identical OpenNMS installs, had them discover the network at exactly the same time, there still might be a difference in what the node ID is associated with each particular node. This is why the foreign source, foreign ID are so important, because those will not change. And the foreign source here is this class, which is the name of our requisition, and the foreign ID is this long number. And that came from our requisition itself. Now let's look at events. If I click on events, it'll bring me to the event browser. Now, we used to have a way to acknowledge events, and no one ever really used it. So I'm not quite sure. This is a bug. Technically, it's a mistake, and we just call that a bug. Notice that events is outstanding as part of my filter. There's not going to be any acknowledged events, so clicking that just shows up 0. But we have focused, since we came from the localhost node, by clicking on events, we only see events for that node. I'm actually going to remove that so we can see all the events that have happened recently. And I want to go over what we did. So, starting with this event 18, remember when we turned on notices? That caused an event. OpenNMS is very, very event-driven, so almost everything we do in the GUI is driven by events. In fact, if you download our mobile app, which is called Compass, if you download Compass by OpenNMS, you will see that has no tie-in whatsoever to the OpenNMS code. It's all done through REST and events. So when we changed the notifications on, it generated an event. And you can see this is a warning event. Maybe maybe we didn't want to turn notices on. The next event we saw is we ran that synchronize button. When we hit the synchronize button, it ran the model import process. So it went and looked at a particular file on the file system. Everything we do in the GUI here, for the most part, is reflected in XML files. And so we can actually go and see an XML file that pretty much duplicates what we did to the GUI. The beauty of this is it gives you a choice. You could script the output. And in fact, this model import process was done for this huge company in Switzerland. And they had 70, 80,000 devices that they wanted OpenNMS to monitor. And this was back when we didn't have anything like this. And so they came to us and said, we don't want to use auto discovery at all. We will give you an XML file that has a list of, here's our node, here's its name, here's all the asset information for it, here's all its categories, here's the interface, here's the services, make it happen. And so in 1.6, we introduced the model importer. And that's why we have this model import process. Now, that part hasn't changed very much. I mean, we've made it a lot more efficient, and we've rolled it into something called Provision D. But basically what happens is, notice, we reloaded the import, which causes the import to start. We added our node. A new node was discovered by OpenNMS. And the interface was discovered. Interface 127.0.0.1 was discovered and associated with node 1, and the ICMP service was added. Remember, we forced the ICMP service to be added to the node. Notice these occur all at the same time, so in the GUI they display slightly out of order. What definitely happened was the node was added, the interface was added, and the service was added in that order, but they all show up here just because the fact that we don't have that kind of granularity in the web UI. Now the next thing we saw is this event here that says the model importer process has completed successfully. Yay! In the old model importer process, we would be done. There was no automatic discovery whatsoever. And that could be a problem. If you didn't know what was on your network, you may know some aspects of your network, but you may not know everything. And so you want to discover it. So Provision D, which is the successor to both CapsD, which was our old automated discovery, and the model importer, then does a scan phase. And in our scan phase, we discovered 3 additional services. We discovered the OpenNMS JVM service. This allows us to monitor various performance issues with OpenNMS, which is cool. We also discovered SSH, because that service is running, and we discovered SMTP. And finally, we got node scan depleted. At this point in time, we know that the process is done. Now, it's cool that SMTP is installed on this box, because if I happen to jump over here to my system, you'll see I have new mail. You have new mail. And if I type mail, you'll see there's a message. Actually, I meant to delete these. Okay, honest, I had to redo this class because I forgot the mic, so I didn't delete these old messages. So let me just do that while we're sitting here. Delete 1 through 4. And now I'll put out of here. So let's pretend you didn't see that, and we go in and we look at mail. Now, yay, I have a message. Message number 1, look, notice 1, localhost discovered. And if I look at it, it says OpenNMS has discovered a new name named localhost. Please be advised. So if you remember from Module 2, where we actually put root at localhost as our user's email, that was to make that happen. By default, Red Hat installs, I believe it's Postfix as the SMTP server, and so we were able to send mail to localhost and get it to run. Now, on my system, I had to install MailX, so I did a yum install MailX in order to get a command line mail. I'd mentioned before, I like using minimal installs, and so what we want to do is make sure that we, if you do that, you will probably need to install MailX in order to recreate what I've done here. Okay, so let's go back. Now, if we go back to the admin page, configure OpenNMS and provisioning requisitions, remember I kind of talked about the scan phase. So the first part of a synchronization goes and does what the model importer used to do. It updates the database and it adds things, it forces things. But we also want to be able to scan things. And the way we do this is through what's called a foreign source. So if I click here, Edit Default Foreign Source, you will see the different services that we provide. So it gives you a date, it says it's last modified, scanner interval is 1 day, and you can see we have this DNS service that runs the DNS detector, the FTP service that runs the FTP detector, HTTP, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If I go to the next page, you'll see, there is SSH, and that's what discovered the SSH service running on this system. Now, I want to stress, when we start talking about discovery and monitoring are different. So if I go to my first page here, I've got this class, and a class is basically a piece of code in Java it's the HTTP detector. Now what this is going to do is, now we have, I'm going to skip back to the second page, we have this MS RDP detector, because we can monitor the RDP service running on Windows machines. And basically all we do is, we don't have a special detector for it, we use the TCP detector. And all it basically does is go and look at the port that I've configured. So we have a parameter here called port. So it connects to port 3389. If there is something listening on port 3389 and it's able to make a TCP connection, it will add the MS RDP service to this interface in this device. Now, we used to do that for the SSH monitor. So we just use the TCP detector with a parameter of port 22, because that's the well-known port for SSH. Worked fine. It would discover SSH running on a particular system. Now, the problem was, in SSH, it will actually expect a reply. So one of the things I stress in this class is no magic. I work with so many people in IT who don't understand first principles. And so it's all magical for them. It's like, well, reboot, because that fixed it last time. Or, it's almost the equivalent of, hold down Control-Alt-J-P and then sacrifice a chicken over the keyboard at midnight while wearing a white robe during a full moon. I hate that. So while I find OpenNMS to be quite magical, there's nothing magic about it. So the way the SSH detector works is it basically just telnets. Now, Telnet is, I hate Telnet. You don't want to run Telnet as a service, but the command line tool Telnet is useful for diagnosing TCP things. So I'm going to Telnet to localhost on port 22. And you see I got a connection. So connected, I got this banner that says SSH OpenSSH 6.6.1. And so we know in the old days, all we would do was connect and look for SSH in the banner. You can add a parameter that says, hey, what banner is on here? And you can look for it. This can be very, very useful if I wanted to separate SSH 2.0 from SSH 1. What I could do is I could create a TCP connector that connected to port 22 and looked for the string SSH-2.0 or SSH 1.0, and I could discover different services. Of course, I'd end up having to name them differently to separate them out, but I could do that. Now, the problem is this generates logs. And so we have a lot of anal retentive IT admins who work with OpenNMS, and I respect that. And so they were complaining, hey, we're getting all these logs because every 5 minutes when we tried to connect to the particular device, it would send us that banner and then expect a reply. And of course, the TCP detector never sent the reply back, and so it would generate these logs. So we switched to an SSH detector. So we do have a specific detector. Now, if I go back to my HTTP example, so I have an HTTP detector that detects the HTTP service. We have the HTTPS detector, which adds an additional check, which is it over secure sockets? So is it an HTTPS connection versus an HTTP connection? Now, I could have just connected to port 80 and looked at a banner and looked for a particular Apache banner or whatnot. But the HTTP detector is much more than that. What it does is it connects, it actually sends a GET, and it looks for a return code. So let's do that from here, again, using our amazing telnet. So I will telnet to www.opennms.org on port 80, and then I'm going to issue a GET /http/1.0. Hit enter a couple of times, and yay, I got some output. So I go up here, and you can see there's this big output. What we care about is this return code right here. And it says HTTP 1.1 200 OK. If I get a valid return code, that means it's an HTTP server. So it's much more than just a port check. So we can say, hey, yeah, there's an HTTP server. Now the difference between a detector and say a monitor is, what if I got a 500 error back? That means the server is misconfigured. It's not running, it's down. But if I get a perfectly formatted 500 message back, that tells me it's an HTTP server. So the HTTP detector will discover HTTP on that interface, but the monitor, once it kicks in, will immediately mark it as down. And we'll discuss more of this when we talk about service monitoring in a later lesson. Okay, going back to our slide. So what happened? So when we provisioned a node, it created a node added event. And since notices were on globally, we'd hit that big red button or turned off the big red button and changed our icon to green. It was checked against the notification configuration. Lo and behold, there was a notice built against the node added event, so it was triggered. It was then checked against a filter, which it passed, so it was sent. And in order to send it, it followed a particular destination path. In this instance, the email admin destination path, which is why me, being a user in the email admin group, got the notice. So let's walk through that. I want to go through this through the GUI. So going back to admin, under configure notifications, there's 3 sections: configure event notifications, configure destination paths, and configure path outages. And we'll talk about all 3 of these. Now, if I click on event notifications, here are the 9 default events that trigger notices. There are 4 threshold events. High threshold's exceeded, the high threshold's been rearmed, low threshold exceeded, low threshold's been rearmed, and we'll talk about these later. These are off by default. When we ship OpenNMS, we set a series of thresholds to demonstrate how it's done. And I won't say that the numbers, they're acceptable, but they may not be useful to large environments. And so if you get some discards or errors, you might get overwhelmed with threshold events. And we didn't want those sending notifications. So as you can see, these are off by default. Now the 5 that are on are the ones I mentioned before: interface deleted, interface down, node added, node down, and node lost service. And we were looking at the node added event. So I'm going to edit the node added event. And this brings me to this huge list of events. OpenNMS ships with tens of thousands of events pre-configured. And you can see here, this says OpenNMS defined node event, node added. This came, if you will remember from lesson 3, we have that event label. And this is where the event label shows. So if you're doing your own, start the event label with either the name of your company or the couple of A's, so it'll show up, because there are lots of events here in this system. And when I mentioned in the event comp file in lesson 3, you can actually turn off some of those events so it doesn't fill up your web UI. But we're going to show you a real easy method which bypasses the screen, so you don't have to pick out what you want. Now, I'm going to use this one thing to kind of complain. When I was starting out in network management, HP was kind of the network management company. They had this thing called OpenView, this suite of tools called OpenView that everyone used, and everyone thought they were just the cat's pajamas when it came to network management. Well, for HP JetDirect devices, which make up a lot of printers, they have a MIB, but they don't use any variables. So if there's a paper jam or something like that, they can't tell you what type of paper using a variable. So they explicitly state. So if this trap here occurs, this looks like it's asking to manually feed in some paper. If I need to feed in letter paper, that's one event. If I need to feed in legal paper, that's another event. Ledger, that's another event. It's crazy. But I just want to point out, I learned about this stuff called a Japanese round-trip postcard. My belief is it's a postcard that's actually 2 portions, and when you get it, you can tear off the bottom and send it back. And I just thought that was kind of cool. But anyway, so here are all the events that ship with OpenNMS by default. And we add more with every release, and we encourage you guys to add more as well. When we start talking about S&P events, I'll show you how to do that. Now when I hit next, this brings up the filter page. Now if there's anything I want you to do with OpenNMS is, if you hear the term filter or rule, remember, all the filter or rule does is return a list of IP addresses from the database. It's not magical. And in this case, IP adder not equal to 0.0.0 is a pass for everything. So this is our example of a null filter. So we're going to pass every node added event that comes through here. Now the node added event, if you'll remember, did not have an interface or a service. If it had a service, you could filter on further on the service name. Or you could filter on not the service name. You could say, I'm not interested in any OpenNMS JVM events, and that would limit that. If you remember, OpenNMS was initially very much based upon monitoring services. And so some people might want to say, oh, if this is the MySQL service, send it to the database team. If this is the HTTP service, send it to the web team. If it's ICMP, send it to a network team. And this was an easy way for them to do that. They could configure a rule that said, here's one node loss service event that goes to the web guys. Here's a node loss service event that goes to the database guys, etc. And this is where you would do that. If you do configure a complex rule, you can test it against devices in your system by clicking on this link that says validate rule results. I'm going to skip this for now. And this goes to the last page for this. This determines what kind of text gets sent out on an OpenNMS notice. So notice the name of this notice is called node added. There's no description. There really should be, so I'm going to add one. This notice gets sent. This notice gets sent when a new node is added to OpenNMS. You can further refine this on parameters. This is very, very useful for thresholds. So let's say I have a parameter which is a data source name, the data source name might be disk utilization. So I could say trigger this threshold event when the threshold is exceeded and the data source happens to be disk. So I would ignore temperature, CPU, memory, those kind of things. Now we talked about paths. By default, remember, we went to the email admin path, and so that's why that's there. And now we have this little text message. OpenNMS has discovered a new node named %parm node label % please be advised. That goes right back to our mail. Let me clean this up. Get back to mail. So if you look, OpenNMS has discovered a new node named localhost. Please be advised. So when the notice was sent, it substituted in the node label, which we called localhost, as a parameter. I'm going to talk more about this in a second. Now with this short message, and you can see this says 111-notice ID. In this case, it would be notice ID 1. And 111-1. Well, this was back in the day when people still carried numeric pagers. And so 111-1 would tell you a node was added and you needed to go look up notice ID 1. Now we use this for SMSs. So you want to keep these messages under 140 characters so it fits in one. So I might change this to say the same thing here, which is the node was discovered. I'm lazy, so I can't paste. So I can add node localhost was discovered. So that would get sent out. And then when we send an email, there's a subject field we can use, which will say notice number 1, node label discovered. So if I go back to my mail, you will see notice number 1, notice localhost discovered is the subject of the email. So I'm not lying, this stuff actually works. Now we're going to talk more about these event and notice substitutions later. There's a whole bunch of them. And you can see that you can put in time, interface, node label, so there's a bunch of parameters. Now, getting back to the slides, I want to review what we've done. So we went to the configuration menu, we configured notifications, we configured event notifications, we saw that there was a node added event. We didn't apply any filters, but here is where we would if we wanted to do that, and then we define the notice. Now, In the interest of no magic, I'm going to spend a few minutes talking about the database. OpenNMS uses Postgres as the underlying database. And we actually use a technology called Hibernate, which should allow us to abstract the database calls from OpenNMS. So instead of actually writing select star from node where node label equals X, we would write code that would access a data access object. And Hibernate would turn that into select star from node where. There's still a lot of legacy code in OpenNMS. I mean, almost all the code that has been written in the last 5 or 6 years uses Hibernate, but we're still not there yet. I keep pushing for it because I have I'm anal retentive. I have little OCD issues, but as my very smart business partner points out, we don't have at the moment an economic incentive to make that happen. This may change in the future, but right now we don't. So it's happening very, very slowly. So anyway, that said, we use Postgres. So to access Postgres, you use the PSQL command. So on the command line, I type PSQL. If OpenNMS is living on a different, if the database, if Postgres is living on a different server, I would type -h, and then I'd put, DB host name. I would put the name here. In this case, it's running on localhost, so I can leave that blank. And I'm going to type -U user OpenNMS because I want to log in as the OpenNMS user, and I want to connect to the OpenNMS database. So here I am. Now, if you notice from this event, our event ID, let's navigate away from here. I'll hit finish. I'm going to go to our notice. Oh, I acknowledged it, so I'll go under status notifications, show all acknowledged notices, and there's the acknowledged notice. It says I acknowledged it, and I'm going to click on event ID. So the event ID is 21. So I want to look further at event ID 21. So I'm going to say select star from, if I can type today, from events where event ID equals 21, semicolon. And there I get this output. One of the cool tricks about OpenNMS is this, sometimes you can do a list. So I can do select star from services, and it all fits. So it all fits on one page, and so you can see we only have discovered we've only discovered 4 services on a particular node. These are the 4 services that are associated with localhost. But if I wanted to see the kind of spread out event one, I can use the expanded mode. So I hit \x. Just to show you, if you hit \?, it'll show you all the different options. So if you remember, \ is the internal command escape for PSQL. You can remember to do this, and you can find the \x for expanded mode. Now when I type the expanded display and I look at my event, voila, it shows up in a readable format. So this is event ID 21. There is the UEI, node added. It's node ID 1. Here's when it happened. It came from provision D, because provision D is the process that discovered this. This tells us where the event could have come from trap D. It could have come from the polar. There's a bunch of different processes that generate events. What I want you to focus on here is this event parm. Remember, we talked about the parameter aspect with notices. So if we go back to the slide, you'll see right here, we have this %parm node label. All this does is go to the database record for the event, look at the parms field and say, is there a parm called node label? If it is, print out whatever the value is. So we have 2 parms associated. I mean, some events won't have any parameters whatsoever. But in this case, we have the node label parameter and the node label source. When we provision a device, we set the node label. So we set ours to be localhost. U is user set. So we user defined this event, and that'll be the default for everything we requisition. If we use automatic discovery, if you scan a range, it uses a variety of tools. It'll try to do a reverse lookup on the IP address and get a DNS name. If it's a Windows box, it may get the NetBIOS name. It may use, if it has SNMP installed, it can use the SNMP system name, and that will change the node label source. Again, no magic. If you're curious about an event that comes in and you want to see what parameters get sent with it, look in the database. This is very, very useful with SNMP traps, which we'll talk about a bit later. So to get out of here, it's \Q, so I'm out of here, and so that's enough of that. Let's go back to notices. Okay, we haven't talked about destination paths. So I'm going to go back to the GUI and do that. So I go to admin, configure OpenNMS, and I go to my configure notifications. Now I'm going to click on the second link here, destination path. And as you can see, we only have the email admin path, so I'll edit it. So it says the name is email admin. Now we have a convention in OpenNMS that usernames start with lowercase letters and groups start with uppercase letters. So I know that this says email admin. This is email the admin group, not just the admin user. I do set up paths for users, like we monitor our soda machine in OpenNMS, in the OpenNMS office, and I like to know, it just tickles me to no end, to get an email that says someone bought a Coke. And then I wonder, who could have bought a Coke? Now, that gets sent just to me, because I'm not going to fill up people's mailbox. I mean, we only sell 3 or 4 a day, but I'm not going to fill up people's mailboxes with useless information like that. I love the thing, so it's just for me. Now, if we actually hit a threshold, if we run low on a soda, I get sent, and I also send it to Tina, our office manager, because she'll go and refill the machine. So there's a lot of usefulness for setting up different paths. But the convention is email admin says email the admin user. It's our default path for our 5 default notifications that are enabled when you install OpenNMS. So that's why we wanted to add us to the group. I'll talk about this initial delay a little bit more, but we have our targets. So let me edit the targets. There are 4 different targets within a path. You can target individual users. So I could target me, I could target admin. If we added more users, I could target an individual user. I could target a group. Now by default, there's only 2 groups, admin and remoting users. I'm part of the admin group, and as you can see, admin is selected. If I shift click, I can click more than one group. If I control click, I can unselect those. Now in our exercise, we're going to talk about roles. If you'll remember from lesson 2, we talked about duty schedules. And we're going to review that in a second. But users and groups can have duty schedules. And if they do, it determines who gets the message and who doesn't. Now, we had a customer come to us and say, what we've been doing is on Monday, the manager comes in and they will add a 24/7 duty schedule to the on-call person. And then they will remove the 24/7 schedule from the person who was on call the previous period. Sometimes they forget. Can we have some way to schedule an actual role? Can we create roles within OpenNMS and have them get notified? And so they paid us, we implemented the feature, and now everyone gets to use it. And we're going to do that as part of the exercise. Finally, we have email addresses. You can actually put email addresses, and we'll send an email to them based upon the notification. I do have very brave customers who send emails to their customer as soon as it happens. As soon as OpenNMS detects a problem, they send an email to the customer that says, hey, we're aware of this problem, we're working on it. Kind of cool. I'm not sure I'm brave enough to do that, but it's kind of cool. So here are the 4 different targets we can have. Next, if you've selected a group, you can delay sending the notice to members of that group. So by default, it's 0 minutes. We're going to leave it as the default, but I could use any of these 1 minute, 2 minute, up to 1 day. So I could actually say, hey, send the notice, wait a day. Send it to the next person in the group, wait a day. If you remember from Module 2, when we assigned us to the group, you can order who's in the list in that group, and this is where that comes into play. So the first person in that list gets the notice, then the second, then the third, then the fourth, in that order. Setting it to 0 means that it will send it to everybody in the group at once. And finally, here is how are we going to notify? So we do have an integration with the Asterisk PBX where it will actually call you and speak information about the notice. If you're an IRC fan, you could actually set up a channel and have OpenNMS paste the notice to a channel. You can send emails. You can microblog. So if you want, you can tweet. And this tells you the different types of tweets you can do. Back in the day, you could send pages. And we also have built-in XMPP support. This is kind of your Jabber Google Talk support. So if you guys use that, you can actually send a notice to a group, which is usually a static room that people can join, or you can send XMPP message will send to users XMPP configured information as configured for that user. Now I want to talk a second here about Java email. So it seems kind of weird saying Java email. Again, this is a legacy thing. Originally, we actually used the bidmail command to send email. The problem is that spawns a shell. It uses a lot of resources. And so let's say I have a group with 10 people in it, and I get 4 notices I need to send immediately. I end up sending 40 notices. So I've got to spawn 40 bin mail processes. That might work. What if it was 400? So it was not efficient. So we rewrote Notifd to be able to accept Java code as an action as well, and we used a Java mailer library. And so that's what we use by default. So technically this should be called email and pager email, because no one, to my knowledge, uses the old school mail and email notification commands. But as with many things OpenNMS, this is a piece of legacy that we haven't fixed yet. Maybe it'll be changed in a different release. And I can show you how to change it if you want in the next lesson, where we will talk about notification commands. Now, the difference between email and pager email, remember my email address for this is root@localhost, so that sends email to localhost. Pager email would be something like if you send a message to my phone number at txt.att.net, I get an SMS. So that's kind of useful. So I might want to say, okay, immediately send an email to my group. If no one acknowledges the notice to stop escalations, then what I want to do is send an SMS using Java pager email. That works very, very well as long as your network's up, as long as you can reach your mail server. When we talk about, in the next notification lesson in 4-2, we'll talk about commands, and I'll show you how to set up something different in case you wanted to use a different tool that doesn't rely on the network, such as a modem that can connect to the cellular network. And then when I'm done, and I'm going to finish. And I can add escalations, etc. like that. So we're actually going to do an exercise that covers this. So I'm just going to cancel out of here. And again, repetition is basic to all learning. What we did was we went to the configuration page. We configured notifications. We configured destination paths. We edited the email admin. We examined the 4 different targets that we can use. Talked about the group delay, and we talked about the different services we can use. Now, one of the main complaints we get when new people install OpenNMS is that they say, I turn notices on, I'm not getting any notices. Well, email's been around for a really long time, and email in and of itself isn't very secure in the sense that anyone can send you an email. And so great pains have been taken to get rid of things like spam. So there's all kinds of filters and spam detection tools. One of those things is basically if I get an email from root@127.0.0.1, I don't want to answer it. I don't want to send it through. But we needed something to put as the default from address for sending notices. So we use root@127.0.0.1. I strongly recommend you change this. So going into the opt-to-OpenNMS Etsy directory, there is a file called Java Mail Configuration.properties. This is a properties file. Let me edit it with Vim so we get the pretty syntax. And so you can see, I strongly recommend everyone change this. And what I usually do is I just create it as OpenNMS at example.com. If you set up an email address, it doesn't even have to exist, but if you set up an email address with your domain, so yourcompanyname.com, that usually is enough to get through your mail server. So what OpenNMS will do is, by default, it's going to connect to mail host localhost 127.0.0.1. It's going to use SMTP send on port 25 to send an email. So if you have your virtual machine or OpenNMS system sending mail from the command line, and that works just fine, this should work just fine. So this will go ahead and connect. And I'm going to show you an example of doing something slightly different. Now, I wouldn't make up an address. I would actually have an address that is somewhat monitored. The reason being is you may end up accidentally sending notices to people who don't want them, or they might have a problem. So they're going to hit reply. And they're going to send probably a harshly worded email. Stop sending me notices. So for just karma purposes and making the world a happier place, you might want to set up a username that is monitored and have someone check into it periodically to make sure that there's not a misconfiguration. The one last thing I want to talk about here in this file is the content type. By default, we send plain text mails. So if I go back to, I'll have to show you after this. If I look at my mail, you'll see that it's actually in plain text. You may want to change that to HTML. If you want to do a lot of embedding of links and things like that, it'll look prettier. I'm an old school guy. I prefer plain text mail. So I am going to save this. Whoops. Let me quit out of this. And just to show you what I was talking about with mail, as you can see, the content type, it's text plain. And you can change that. To change that, you would just edit this file. And I'm going to show you an example using Gmail. So let's say you can't set up your OpenNMS system to talk to your mail server. Or you want to be more secure. What you can end up doing is you can actually put in your mail server's host name and use your local username and password in this file to send email. We used to do, in the class, we used to do a Gmail example. So we say use SMTP, whoop, I can't highlight that. Use SMTPS, connect to smtpgmail.com on port 463, use SSL, and authenticate using your username at gmail.com, your Gmail password, and send the message as HTML. And so this will actually work. If you set up a username in Gmail, you can actually use this to send to Gmail from OpenNMS. So again, Java mail configuration properties sets up how mail gets sent. And here's an example using an alternative email versus the email configured on the server itself. Duty schedules. So I'd mentioned when we talk about users, you can assign duty schedules. If you're not on duty, if someone adds a duty schedule, by default, everyone's on duty 24 hours. But if you add a duty schedule, you'll get notices only when you're on duty. If you're not on duty, that gets discarded. You will never get the notice. Now, groups can also have duty schedules. They behave slightly differently. When you send a notice to a group, those get queued. If they get acknowledged before the group comes back on duty, nothing happens. It gets deleted and we're done. But if they're still open when the group comes back on duty, it will get sent. This is great. I actually set it up for me to be, I don't want things coming at night. So because we don't really have anything in our configuration that is critical. And plus I have an IT guy and he gets it 24/7. But what I do is I set mine from 7 a.m. to 7 p.m. And so what happens is that when I wake up in the morning at 7 o'clock, I occasionally get an email that tells me something's down on the network. And that's pretty cool. If it bounced all night, but it was up when I woke up, I won't get a notice, which is nice. This is overridden by users. If I set up a group duty schedule and a user duty schedule and the group's on duty, but I'm not, again, if I'm not on duty, I don't get notices. Finally, on-call roles always get notices. If you send to a role, a notice will be sent. There's nothing about duty schedules. So let's sum that up in a pretty horrible looking flowchart. So starting at the S here, start. If you're in a role and it's sent to a role, you get notified. End. We're done. So you get notified. If, however, it's sent to a group, if the group is on duty, it gets sent to you, only if you are on duty. So if you're on duty, it gets sent, you get notified. If not, end. However, if the group is not on duty, it'll queue. And it'll sit there until the group comes back on duty or the notice is acknowledged, and then you'll get notified. Make sense? Okay, one final thing to talk about it before we get to the exercise, path outages. Now, a little bit of history. The three original founders of OpenNMS, we came from a company that focused on root cause analysis. So they had code that would go and analyze when there was an outage, where the root cause was. So if it was an interface on a router, it would suppress all the alerts from downstream devices, and it would just tell you the interface on this router is a problem. We all left that company, and at the time, our chief technical officer had written almost all of their root cause code, and I was worried that if we touched anything and called it root cause, we get sued. They'd say, oh, you stole our code, you stole our ideas, and there wasn't enough of a clean room environment. Now, that guy has since left the company, so we can say that. We don't really have any of that knowledge anymore, but we needed something years ago that helped, at least, if not true root cause, it needed to stop a flood of notices. And we call this path outages. Now, my dream of path outage is more along the lines of our business service monitor, in the sense that we can set up services and we can say, hey, this service is degraded because this piece is down. We don't do that right now. It's very, very simple. The path outage feature does this. When a node down event, and specifically a node down event, is received, and path outages are enabled, what we will do is we will ping the parent node to see if it's up. If we can't ping the parent, we assume it's a network issue, and so we just do not send the notice on that node down event. So if you think about it, this actually kind of copies that example I was telling you about an interface on a router being down. So let's say I have a Class C network beyond a router, and it's connected to, from the OpenNMS server to that network is through an interface on a router, and that interface goes down. Well, if I have 10 nodes on that network, I'm going to start getting node down events. And they're going to each try to ping that upstream interface, because that would be the parent of the node. You configure that. So that would be the parent of the node. And if I can't ping it, I'm just going to suppress all the node down events. Eventually, OpenNMS will get around to testing that service, and it'll get an interface down event, which it will send. So I will get a notice that an interface is down, but it'll suppress the node down notices. The events themselves will exist. So when I get that notice and log into the GUI, I will see that all 10 of those nodes are down. But at least I'll have a clue as to what's happening, and my mailbox or pager won't be completely covered in messages. Now, you configure all this in that path outages option. I'll show you that in a second. But you can also set a default parent node. This is, if you enable path outage, it will be the device used by everybody. And I suggest you use something on your LAN. I would not use the OpenNMS box itself, because I can ping an interface on a server with a cable out. Unless I yank the NIC card out, it's going to ping. So you don't want to do that, or otherwise path outage will just be disabled, because it'll always be able to ping, it'll always send the node down messages. What I usually do is I set the next hop. I set the router on the LAN segment for the OpenNMS server. And so if I ping that, if I can't ping that, I assume there's a huge network outage, and therefore there's a problem. Now to configure this, we go to Configure OpenNMS, and I go, again, Notifications, and we're going to do the third and last menu, Add Item Path Outages. And so I'm going to call this, let's say we have a 172.20.20 network, and I get to it through the 172.20.20.1 address. So I'm going to add that address here, and I'm going to make a rule. And I'm going to say IP adder IP like 172.20.20.2 through 254. So it basically says if I get a node down on 172.20.20.2 up to 254, my critical path address is going to be 172.20.20.1. And you can show the matching node list. I haven't added any nodes here, so I'll validate the rule results. So it works, and I hit finish. And now I have a path outage. And I can actually go up and under info, I can click on path outages, and it'll tell me there's no path outage right now. If I did have a path outage in effect, it would show me here. So this is very, very useful. So it would tell you where on the path it's down, etc. So if I came in and I was flooded with messages on my front screen, I'd go to info path outages, and it would show me where the issue was. Make sense? Hope so. Okay, lesson. We're going to do an exercise, and this incredibly long module will come to an end. Aren't you glad I broke it into two? Because we're going to spend another half hour in the second half. But anyway, remember from our first lesson, we created a happiness event because, hey, the class is happy. Now, we don't want to notify when the class is happy, because there's nothing to do. Class is happy. But I do want to know if the class is unhappy. So we're going to add an unhappiness event to our event configuration. We're then going to create a new on-call role. And I'll show you how that works. And then we're going to create a new destination path just for this exercise that will send to the on-call group, wait a minute, send to the admin group, which we're a part of, wait a minute, and then send to the user. So we'll get to see that work. Then we're going to create a notice on the new event, assign this path to it, and we'll generate the event, make sure it works. Sound like fun, huh? Well, the first thing we have to do is define our unhappiness event. So if you guys remember, I'm putting all of this stuff up on this directory called capital T training on www.opennms.org. And I'm going to put all my slides and videos here so you don't have to kind of figure out how to get them off of YouTube. So you'll have a copy of the video, you'll have a copy of the PDF of the slides I just showed you, and the config. So I'm going to click on config, we're in exercise 4, and there's a new class events file. So here's our original event. So there is the class is happy event. We're going to add a new one, the class is not happy, right here. And so this is not, now you may be tempted to cut and paste this into the class.events.xml file. I want to stress, if you do, use the source, because that lays it out prettier. So we don't necessarily want to do this one because it adds a bunch of different formatting that isn't as nice. That's what's going on. As you can see, this reference here, this dance everybody dance, life is good, life is fun, is an obscure reference to an animated short called Rejection, which I just love. It's a scene in there. It's pretty, it can be kind of disgusting, so you may not want to click on that, but look it up if you are into that sort of thing. Otherwise, I can't get no satisfaction. You guys should be able to recognize that song. So I put that in here. And again, all of this here was just to show that you can embed HTML. If you remember, this is a less than sign, this is a greater than sign. So this is going to create a paragraph and an unnumbered list here. You can embed links. You can do lots of cool stuff in your events and notices. So I just wanted to point that out. So the way I'm going to get this is I'm going to go back here and I'm going to right mouse click on class events and copy the link location. And then I'm going to go back to my terminal session and I want to CD to the events directory. So if you look, I'm in /ops/opennms/etsy/events, and I want to type the command wget-N, and I'm going to paste in my link. That'll go out to the internet, assuming you have access, and it will grab the class events file. Now the reason I use the -N is to clobber the one that was there. Because if I didn't do that, I would have this class events.xml.1 file, and I didn't want that because then I'd have to move it over and everything like that. And now the next thing we have to do is, going back to the slides, so we need to reload the daemon configuration. So the other thing I want you to learn is how to use searching your history. So I'm going to hit Control-R and type in daemon, because I happen to know that's the only command I've done with that string in it. So I hit capital D-A, and now I have redone the, I've reloaded the event configuration, which will update our new class events file, get that loaded into memory, and then I'm going to do Control-R again and look for happiness, and I'm going to send the unhappiness event. Notice I'm going to send it as, I'm going to edit my happiness event and put UN in there, and if I do that, I should be able to go to my GUI, go to info events, or status events, excuse me, all events. And you'll see there I have a perfectly formatted major. Someone needs to do something now. The OpenNMS class is not happy. And notice again, just to kind of keep with the events, we have these two events that get generated when we configure event D. We sent this one in, and this tells us it worked. Now, I want to stress that the UEI you use is case sensitive. So if I go back over here and I send this event in with a capital U, I am going to get an unformatted event because capital U unhappiness is a different event than lowercase unhappiness. This will be important when it comes to dealing with the notices because it's keyed off this UEI. Okay, now that we've generated our unhappiness event, we need to go and trigger a notification on it. So what I'm going to do is we're going to create a role because I promised I'd let you do that. So I'm going to go here. We want to go to Configure OpenNMS, Configure Users, Groups, and On-Call Roles. And we've configured users, we configured groups, so now we're going to configure roles. And I'm going to add a new role. And I'm going to call it On-Call. And we could call it anything. We could call it Class On-Call. We can call it anything. I'm just going to call it On-Call. Now, this is important. You need to choose a supervisor because a supervisor has a very interesting role. They're responsible for maintaining this configuration. If they do not put someone on call, if they do not schedule someone, they get the notice. So the notice will always be sent to somebody. So you assign a supervisor from a member of a group. And so this, I just put, this is a role for being on call. You can put in different descriptions here. But basically, by choosing the group, this gives us the pool of operators we can put on call, which will include the supervisor. And if no one is on call, the admin gets notified. So I'll save that. And this will bring up a nifty little calendar. So this brings up our calendar. And today is Friday the 20th. So I'm going to start here and I'm going to click on the little plus sign and I'm going to make myself on call. So I'm going to make myself on call from, so I'll select me as the user. I'm going to start at, say, 7 o'clock this morning. So 7 o'clock this morning. And let's say I end in 7 days at 7 o'clock in the morning. So that'll put me on call for a week. And I'll save that. And you'll notice that, so today, there's no one on call from 0 to 700 hours. I'm on call all day, Saturday, Sunday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And next Saturday, I'm on call from midnight until 700 hours. Now, one feature that was kind of left off of this is there's not really a way to delete this entry. We wrote this for a feature. For a customer, we wrote a fairly detailed statement of work. They didn't ask for it. We didn't think to put it in, so it's not there. So if you ever need to get rid of something, you can click on the link and you can edit this, and you can just move it to a time in the past. The other thing you can do is, if you're really anal retentive and don't like having that sitting there, you can go into opt OpenNMS etc, and you can look at the destination paths file. And I actually haven't saved this yet, but if I go over here, hit save, this will actually add this as part of the destination. Actually, it's part of the groups. So I added it as part of the groups. So you can see under groups, we have roles. Here's the on-call role. There's my name. I could just delete this bit of the schedule and it would remove it. I'm going to do that because I need to be on call, but just letting you know. No magic. This is not a magical thing. So, okay. So getting back to the slides, we created our on-call role. Now we need to create a new destination path because we want to notify in a very certain method only a certain group of people when the unhappiness event happens. So I'm going to go here, again to admin, under notifications, configure destination paths, and I'm going to create a new path, and I'm going to call it path for class. I've been criticized in that I use the term class way too much. It's like on everything, and in doing so, it kind of makes it hard for people to tie things together. So I'm going to make a conscious effort to change this from path for class, from just putting class on everything. So again, my initial target, I want to send to the on-call role. That was part of our, if we go back to our slide for the exercise. So we want to send to on-call, wait a minute, send to group, and wait a minute, send to user. So I'm going to set on-call, I'll hit next. I'm going to use Java email, and I'm done. Now I'm going to click this add escalation button. I'm going to add the admin group. Again, hit next. I'm going to send to everybody in the group at the same time. Send everybody to the group at the same time. Hit next. We still use Java mail. So send that. I'm going to add another escalation where I send it exactly to me. And so now I have 3 escalations. Immediately gets sent to on-call. I'll add a delay of 1 minute before it gets sent to the admin group, and then I'll add another delay of another minute before it gets sent here. We're going to talk a bit about this initial delay in the next module, but you can add an initial delay, and the reason is if the notice gets automatically acknowledged before anything gets sent, it won't walk the path at all, which is kind of cool. So now I have a path for class path. Going back to the slides. So we've got the on roll call, we've got path for class. And now we need to assign that to the new notice. So going back to our event, so status events, all events, I'm going to go to here and make sure I don't click on the unhappiness event. I'm going to click on the unhappy, edit notifications for this event. Boom. That takes me directly past that page where I had to select from that huge list of events. If you haven't trimmed your event list, and you don't really have a reason to do so, it doesn't really impact performance all that much, you can use this to skip selecting your event from a list. I want this to match I don't want to filter this at all. I want all of the unhappiness events to get a notice. So I'll skip results. And I'll call this the unhappiness notice. This notice gets sent when the class unhappy event arrives, which is good. This notice gets sent when the class unhappy event arrives. There's not going to be any parameters, but we could filter on it. I'm going to choose my path. I'm going to do path for class. Now for the text message is, I want to put something like the class, can't type today. The class is unhappy. Perhaps they would rather be updating their, I want to put in a link. Google Plus page. You can get really creative with notices. So you can embed a link. I'm going to embed a link here. Now I'm going to also expose a small bug, but I'm going to embed a link here. For the short message, I'm going to put something just like the class is unhappy. And for the notice, I'll do something similar. I'll leave the notice ID and I'll put the class is not happy. Now you could embed stuff in here, and I'm going to show you how that works. But we'll talk about all the different substitutions you can make in a future slide. So I'm going to hit finish here. This will take me back to the main page. Notice that here's our event. The OpenNMS class is not happy. Unhappiness notice. It is on by default. There's some history here. Larry, the guy who wrote the original GUI, was he followed a bunch of standards. And if you look in web standards, buttons are supposed to be actions. Add something, edit something, delete something. Click, click, click. You're doing an action. Well, we used to have a button here. So for high thresholds, this would have said turn on because it's off. And if you wanted to turn it off, it would say turn on, turn off, and you click here and it would swap it. The problem is OpenNMS is pretty international, and if English is not your first language, if you saw the word on, you'd probably think it was on. It's confusing. If you saw the word off, it meant it was on. If you saw the word on, it meant it was off. And I brought this up in class. This was probably 10 years ago. I'm talking to people. I'm bringing this up in class. Be careful. Turn off means it's on. Turn on means it's off. And guy leaned back and said, why don't you just make them radio buttons? So over lunch, I changed this piece of code, and now they're radio buttons, so that you can kind of glance at it and see that they're off or on. So I made sure it's on. So let's review what we've done. So we downloaded the new class events file, which defined our unhappiness event. We generated the event to make sure it worked. We added a new on-call role. We created a new path where the initial target was on call. Then we sent to the admin group. Then we sent to our personal user. And then we edited the notices by clicking on Edit Notices for Event. And here's an example of what we did. I don't do Facebook, and so I do use Google+. It's where the geeks hang out, so I don't know if you guys do that or not, but you could put anything there. I just have fun with this if you're doing this at home. So let's see what happens. So I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to send the unhappiness event. And I'm going to go back to my home page. You can see there's an outstanding notice. I don't have one yet, so I have not been notified. I'll hit refresh. Now, what's happening is that notices get queued every 30 seconds or so. And so there's a queue that gets serviced, so that they're not instantaneous. So now you can see I have a notice. So I'll click on the notice, and there we go. The class is unhappy. The bug I was thinking about is that we have stripped HTML from the HTML from this notice. I don't really like that, so I've opened a bug to see if we can put it back. But it tells us it's a major event, that no one's responded to it, etc. I'm going to click on the ID. And so as you can see, wow, that's kind of messed up. Whoa. Did I screw up the HTML there? It looks like I did. Darn it. I'm not going to do this again. I'm going to go, instead, I'm going to acknowledge this event. And I'm going to go fix it. See, one of the things I like about teaching this class is mistakes get made. And so I'm going to go and edit my event notification. And I also misspelled unhappiness. So I'll edit this. Let's fix problems. What I like, imagine if you have 10 people, they're going to come up with creative ways to break OpenNMS. And it's fun because you're going to do the same thing. Notice I left the quote off. That's what screwed everything up. So I left the closing quote. So I put the closing quote back, and I'm going to repeat the process. If I go here, notice there's no outstanding notices because they're all acknowledged. I'm going to generate the event again. I did get notified, so that's why I have mail. So let's go ahead and refresh this. You'll see that I have an outstanding notice. And now when I click on the notice ID 3 now, you will see, yay, I can right click and say, where's there, open link in new tab. And there we go. That sends me to Google+. Close that out. And you see, I got notified. So I got notified by Java email. This is because I was on call. That's why I got notified first. Now, assume I've run my mouth enough so that a minute has passed. No, not quite. So in a minute, we should be able to see the group get notified, as they get notified second. As long as no one responds to this, as long as no one acknowledges this event, we're going to end up sending the information to the group as well. Maybe I should have put a 30-second delay in here, but we're almost done. So bear with me. So I'll refresh it. There we go. So you can see now I got notified first because I was on call. I got notified a second time because I was in the admin group, but the admin user who's also in that group got notified. And just to show you that I'm not making all this stuff up, if I go to mail, here are my messages. So there's notice 1. That was the first one we did. There's notice 2. That was my mistake notice with the pooched HTML. And now I got the first notice 3 is the one I got from being on call. Then a minute later, I got the second notice because I was in the group. And now I should end up with a third notice. We do not have in OpenNMS this concept of nagging notices. You can kind of build the escalation in. We've had people say, hey, I want to get notified. If it doesn't get acknowledged, keep sending the notification out. We've not done that. There are some tricks you can do. If you Google nagging notices, you can kind of work that in, and there are ways to do it. Again, OpenNMS is a platform. You can configure it in a lot of different ways, but it doesn't. So as you can see, I was notified a third time. There's another little bug which I've reported a little, is that the order of these things change every time I hit refresh. So here I got notified at 1 o'clock, and then I got notified at 1:01, and then I got notified at 1:02. So you can see there was a minute in between each of those. So I got notified. Going back to the slides, as you can see, it worked. We viewed the notice and the escalations. And that's it. That's it for part 1 of notices. I think I've been prattling on for quite a long time. I remembered to turn the mic on this time, so that was good. Please try this at home. The exercises are kind of fun. And in the next module, we're going to talk about these commands. So we're going to actually create a new command, and we're going to repeat this, sending this new command. Anyway, I hope you found this useful, and see you next time.